Today, we are joined by several highly distinguished diplomats and academic experts, and we will begin with each of our panelists briefly presenting opening remarks about Afghanistan's ties to the Caspian region and the role that Caspian countries can play to further engage Afghanistan in regional discussions. Participants are welcome to submit their questions for the panelists using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen at any time. Following opening remarks, we will have what I hope will be a robust discussion about formulating a unified regional response to Afghanistan. Today, we're going to begin with Victor Kipiani. Mr. Kipiani is the chair of the Georgian think tank GeoCase. His interests include international relations, security, governance, and implications of the global order for Georgia and its neighbors. He regularly covers these topics both in English and Georgian language media outlets, and he is also a frequent commentator on political developments in Georgia, as well as on various global geopolitical trends and events. Mr. Kipiani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Todd. Thank you for this kind introduction. Indeed, ending the war in Afghanistan is not just about ending a war. It raises quite sensitive questions about objectives on the Western agenda and how those objectives could have an impact on the Eurasian security landscape. In that respect, and taking into account that the Greater Caspian Region is a linchpin when we speak about the broader security design in Eurasia, definitely the consequences of or repercussions pulling troops out of Afghanistan are not just the matter of the military standpoint, but the developments with broader and geopolitical objectives. So hopefully we will touch on those issues more broadly and more widely in the course of our discussion. Thank you so much, indeed.
The question is, what kind of impact will the Taliban have on the South Caucasus? Is there any threat from the Taliban against the sovereignty and stability of the states in the South Caucasus? So Mr. Kipiani, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to Ambassador Shafiev.
Thank you for this question, which is really very critical from Georgian perspectives. And let me please provide you with some Georgian flavor, if you wish. Since we're not talking about the situation in Afghanistan proper, but there are various implications of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which has dynamized discussions of the West's alleged retreat from peripheral areas, if you will, and growing focus on a single core region. And the line that separates those regions of the world in which the West continues to pursue and defend its interests on a must basis from the secondary ones, in which the West could or would intervene on a highly discretionary basis, and only if a broader context is served. So that line has shifted westwards, and from my perspective, currently lies between the Black and Caspian Seas. In many respects, and hopefully the distinguished audience would agree with me, that this region, when we speak about the South Caucasus in particular, has not only become a border along which geopolitical interests and influences clash, but also positions itself as a key safety locker for many security challenges originating in the Middle East, in the South Caucasus, or the southern flank of Eastern Europe. And therefore, the role and impact of the Black and Caspian, as I call it, intermarium, have indeed never been so meaningful and vital for the emerging Eurasian landscape as they are nowadays. And to expand a little bit more on the question, which is really very broad and very meaningful, it is also a new test for the West to prove its resilience, capability, and commitments in the new order that will arguably be premised on the regional proxy systems, and I call it more nicely regional hub and spoke model of the emerging international order. It is even more important for the West to increase the direct support it provides, to increase the capacity of its allies and partners to defend themselves in those regional systems in which the Western presence is not as direct or tangible as someone would wish. And therefore, the Black Sea, the Greater Caspian region, and the South Caucasus in particular, is clearly a region in which Western interests are reflected also in Georgia's regional posture and conducts, its national defensive capabilities, and foreign policy. I should necessarily mention that after the Afghans drama, this country finds itself in the crosshairs of anti-Western and anti-democratic offensives of various types, colors, and categories. And therefore, successful Western and democratic Georgia would serve as a test of the viability of the principles and values of the Western normative world. And those two sides of the matter, Dr. Todd, these days are strongly interconnected as to be inseparable. Once again, to emphasize that the controversy in Afghanistan has added to the regional dilemma in the aftermath of the Second Karabakh War. And the United States need to demonstrate their dedication to pursuing efforts to develop relations with key allies in this geopolitically important region. Last but not least, specific statements, which we saw in various tangible actions, must contribute to shaping Washington's Black Sea strategy concept along very clear lines, particularly as any delay in this process would further aggravate the security environment. And from my point, that delay could make any future U-turn quite hypothetical too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kipiani. We have a question: can Afghanistan still play a productive role in regional goals of connectivity? And if so, how? I think you started to allude to that in your comments, so if you care to elaborate on that, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the panel. Mr. Kipiani, would you care to respond to that? Can Afghanistan still play a productive role in regional connectivity?
Thank you for your question. I still completely share the points made by previous speaker that primarily the issue at this stage is about security, and once again security. And from Georgian perspectives, I should necessarily point out in a few words that although Afghanistan is geographically far from Georgia, still it matters for us a lot. It mattered during the Afghan campaign because we have participated very actively in NATO-led operations in Afghanistan. And in 2012, 2014, Georgia had up to 1,500 soldiers in Afghanistan, and we lost dozens of officer soldiers there. And most recently, we have supported the withdrawal of NATO and partner forces from Afghanistan and providing them with host nation support and full transit facilities. Also important was Georgian humanitarian contribution to the process. Georgia has set up interagency task force, providing with critical input to ensure the transit of forces and personnel and related support measures. Tbilisi has also agreed to help several international organizations like Asian Development Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to evacuate their staff and provide them with temporary accommodations in Georgia. But the critical issue, in few words, is post-Afghan campaign. And that's also about the security, because abandoning Afghanistan does not mean abandoning a critical region, which is full of threats and challenges. And I mean, trusting the new Taliban government that when the latter has promised to sever its links with various terrorist groups, probably it remains to be seen, how this promise could be fulfilled. And therefore, some nearby presence of US troops is critical to monitor, assess, and react if and when required. During the Geneva summit, President Putin took a firm stance, and we all remember that, against any US presence in Central Asia, regardless of the form. The problem is compounded by the logistical difficulties posed by the great distance to be covered by US aviation based in Qatar in order to reach Afghanistan and the wider region. And besides, we should also take into account Russia and China, who are together are opposed to the very principle of any US return to Central Asia. And these days, Russia is positioning more as a security guarantor, while China is primarily contributing to economics of the Central Asia. We must also not to forget the, well said, historical reluctance, if I may, of the Central Asian countries to harbor foreign troops on their territories. Understandably enough, in both their actions and messages, the various governments of Central Asia have to tread very carefully when dealing with the main actors, particularly as the risks in the region are very high and very real. Therefore, again, to emphasize that all those complexities lead us to the need to identify some other alternative modalities or viable options. And I believe that the Greater Caspian region and the Black Sea, in the first place, present us with some feasible opportunities to contribute to the efforts of the Western coalition to combat international terrorism and extremism. All in all, from my standpoint, Dr. Todd, the Black Sea and the Caspian region are critically important to the greater Eurasian security landscape. In this regard, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, it's not just about messaging an entry into the new stage of the great game for power, but the recent meetings in Moscow between officials from Russia, Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, Iran, and India clearly herald new geopolitical spirals. And therefore, the wider South Caucasus, Central Asia, Caucasus, and South Asia, Central Asia, and Caucasus region could or would fall prey to a new wave of terrorism and radicalization. Therefore, I believe that regardless of different foreign policy objectives, this is a win-win game for all the stakeholders involved. And again, to emphasize that working out a united, coherent, Greater Caspian region policy by the West and by the United States is very critical for Georgia as its linchpin in the region and for the rest of the countries as well.
The country that we haven't talked too much about is Iran, and we have a question about how will Iranian-Taliban relations evolve, particularly given their troubled relationship in the 1990s. I think we'll go to Mr. Mohabit and then Mr. Kipiani for your thoughts on this. Mr. Kipiani.
Yes, of course, Iran has its own say and has its own role, but from the South Caucasian perspectives, I would be arguing that in the broader context, the Iranian stance is a bit lukewarm, if I may, and this is understandable because Iran, if I'm not mistaken, is the only country which has diplomatic and strong diplomatic ties with every single country in the greater region, in the broader region. And of course, Iranians would love to make a meaningful say, but I expect that that meaningful say would be a wish list only, and would be reflected through various regional platforms. And Iranians are pushing very hard, especially when it comes to the South Caucasus. And we had about a few controversial the platforms, but still, their own agenda. This is one point where Iran would be trying to align or to realign its policy with the policy of, say, regional powers. And the second point, which would be limiting Iran's influence, is the exposure of Turkey, and increasing exposure of Turkey in the region. And therefore, I think that the sort of the pushes Iran to Russia, makes it to lean towards Russia, and combine its efforts with Russian efforts. So I think that, of course, Iran would not disappear from the radars, but I think, probably arguably enough, but still, that their voice would not be as powerful and as someone were expecting. And the last sentence, please, if I may, when I was listening to the colleagues from Central Asia, one of the very bizarre things of the modern world, that not only positive agenda could unite the countries, but sometimes the negative agenda. So what happens in Afghanistan and what is happening in Afghanistan could hopefully push Central Asian countries for very pragmatic reasons, to combine their efforts and to create something, which unfortunately, I should admit, we in South Caucasus have not accomplished so far, to provide, for more regional and sustainable framework. And I think that in that respect, that unfortunately negative agenda could help the Central Asian countries to form up in one way or another, either security bloc or the economic bloc. So this is probably the last point to address your question, Dr. Todd. Thank you.
I think one of the lingering questions that remains is how to immediately deal with Afghanistan and the Taliban in the near term. As we've discussed at length in today's session, there is no desire to grant legitimacy to the Taliban government. As Dr. Shaimergenov mentioned in his remarks, they are essentially terrorists. So is it good terrorists, bad terrorists when you're weighing them against ISIS? So we don't want to grant them legitimacy. However, as more and more countries start working with the Taliban out of necessity, you are essentially granting them de facto legitimacy by acknowledging their existence as the government of Afghanistan. But what does this mean for our countries in the Caspian region in the near term? What should they be doing to either engage or not engage with the Taliban in order to work with Afghanistan? We'll start with our speakers in the order that they spoke earlier. So we'll start with Mr. Kipiani and then go to Mr. Mahabat. So Mr. Kipiani, you get to do your closing remarks first.
Well, I fully appreciate that. As I've said, we have a bit some differences, to put this in a way, in foreign policy trajectories, and historical background matters and agendas matters. Again, from Georgian perspective, it matters very much, where the West stands in the region and where that policy is, and ideally, we would welcome unequivocal responses to those policies, because Georgia is punching above its weight. And it's really very critical for us, since we're covering our parts of the world, to unite with the community with whom we share, the same principles and the same objectives, for that community to cover their own path. And therefore, when I spoke about Afghanistan in particular, I was also hinting about difficult, not just hinting, but saying explicitly about difficult security environment in the region, and also hinting to various compensatory security modalities for democracies like Georgia is. And this is my very strong appeal to our allies and partners. We need to cover that road jointly and hand in hand. Thank you.